Hello, everybody. Welcome to Downtime Activities, and welcome to our still, as of yet, unnamed video format where we do essentially bonus actions, but shorter.
Yeah, short discussion.
We sit down to have a discussion about tabletop RPGs, storytelling, just kind of running the game type stuff. It's the conversations we're having anyway, but this just gives them a little bit of focus. And this is something that you and I have discussed off and on a little bit, and we feel like needs some attention as far as tabletop RPGs are concerned, because it, kind of like everything we talk about here, we really feel like it adds a lot to a game, but it's either...
but
it's either not done at all, or done relatively poorly.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part with us, it just hasn't come up in a ton of campaigns, but it's always been for me quite memorable when it has. And it's kind of a funny conversation to broach because of the reputation tabletop games have and the people who play tabletop games have. So let's go over romance options in tabletop RPGs.
Interjection. Have a conversation with the people you play with, where you understand what people are and are not comfortable with.
It has been enough videos without us ringing the social contract gong. So let's ring the social contract gong again.
Yes, social contract is important.
And talk to your players before the game starts, and make sure everybody is comfortable with the content that is going to be in the game.
Mm-hmm. And when we say everybody, we mean everybody, because even if one player is having a sort of romance-adjacent arc for their character, if another character or another player playing a different character is really uncomfortable with whatever the nature of that sort of thing is that's happening is, they will have less fun at the table, and That's not worth it. So don't interject that for one person's benefit to another person's detriment.
We have always kind of been blessed to have a very close-knit play group, a play group where a lot of the lines that we don't want crossed are really pretty clear.
And pretty shared amongst people.
And are a relatively small handful.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of a subset of things that we've all been like, I don't want to be dealing with this shit in my game.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, it's very much shared amongst our play group, and that lets us, and we're still a play group very comfortable with, some players, sort of having access to certain options or certain quest lines, and not necessarily the whole group.
Mm-hmm.
We've never really held that against anybody. So for us, this hasn't been all that much of an issue. But this is one of those things that might seem innocuous on the surface, but could really end up digging at people in the wrong way.
Absolutely. And could, in very extreme case scenarios, ruin campaigns, ruin friend groups and play groups, and end the whole game that you're trying to play with people, whether it's a player or a DM, implementing it in a way that's wrong. So romance is not an important enough piece of the game to force it in if it's going to make it unpleasant for other people. So don't shoehorn it in every game. It's not worth it.
And it's one of those things that may not show up in every game anyway.
However, it can be a very cool and interesting storytelling device, and romance covers a wide swath of things that you can implement in differing levels of depth, I guess. And that is something that can add a lot to a story or add a lot to a character. And that can range from from what we've seen, both from the same player in two different campaigns recently, a womanizing ne'er-do-well and a character who's kind of having a really kind of almost childlike budding romance, and that being a kind of backdrop to part of their story arc. And that can be really, really fun and interesting, both of those things, and add a lot of depth to a character. So let's talk romance. How do you do it right in an RPG?
I mean, again, sort of with that broad view of understanding what people are comfortable with. There's kind of, I think, two main approaches here as far as introducing romances in tabletop RPGs. Either the DM begins to introduce them, or the players begin to introduce them. Either one is totally fine. Either one can really work great. And I think ultimately you'll get the same results out of either one. But it's, in both cases, it's like kind of knowing how far is too far and like take it slow, I guess. At least that just tends to be better. It tends to not make people uncomfortable, and it's there's no problem with a fade to black.
Yes.
Quite often during those kind of quest lines. Nobody needs to hear your 200-page erotic novel in the middle of a game of Dungeons & Dragons or Savage Worlds.
And I think we're a majority, if it's not just people trying to force like particularly uncomfortable subjects that are kind of brush up against the concept of a romance arc, the big place where uncomfortableness comes from is having to role play through a romance adjacent experience, and that's something that very few people want to do at the table.
Yes.
And so there's a very big difference between the womanizing character saying like, I'm gonna go hit on the ladies at the bar in the saloon, and having to go sit there and have the GM sit there and role play a conversation where they're trying to seduce this other character.
It's far better for the most part to just
roll a check,
hand wave.
Yep. Yes.
Just roll your check and move on. There are some conversations that are actually going to be had in character, and those are fine. But everybody at the table should kind of know when to just make the roll and move on. And players, by and large, are fine with that. Players don't want to sit there and romance RP with their game master either. Unless
if they do, that might be the point of your game. If that's something that you really enjoy,
and in particular, if it's a married couple doing a single player game,
yes,
that can be totally different.
Yes, we were speaking average play group, average game here. If that's the point, then you don't watch this video. Go back to your fun little dungeon of romance RP and do your thing. But for this, we're talking about the average RPG group experience, and that will be pretty profoundly uncomfortable for a lot of people to kind of have an in-depth romance RP moment like that.
So if you're a dungeon master and you've decided to introduce kind of a romantic interest for a character, or to begin sort of setting some of that up, what are you expecting to gain from that? What's sort of the goal there?
The goal is, for me, typically is one of a couple of things. Oftentimes it's comic relief. Oftentimes it is a fun little side thing that can be funny and entertaining for the whole table. And that tends to be the ones that are more of the the kind of the player character, the player character who's trying to they
don't have to be a player.
They don't have to be a player. That kind of, those sort of moments, or the kind of one night stand goof 'em up sort of thing that happens, and that tends to be more of the hand wavy. You wake up, you get drunk, you wake up the next morning as a halfling in the bed with like a full-blooded orc, and you're like, Jesus, what happened last night?
I think she was a half-orc, and it was the bride's sister, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so the half-sister. But at any rate...
Now, the Minotaur was full-blooded Minotaur.
Exactly. You can make these kind of funny moments that are memorable, and they're fairly hand-wavy. Right. Comic relief or fun little side things is more often than not where any sort of romance-adjacent play comes in at the tables when I'm running games. The other thing is either kind of meaningful backstory tie-ins or meaningful NPCs that I introduce and there's a connection that the player makes. I very rarely am going to incorporate a romance, like a romanceable character, and to put it into like a game perspective, a video game perspective. I very rarely am going to introduce a romanceable character that isn't in a goofy sort of comic relief moment without the player being the person to kind of instigate that, because I think that avoids the risk of making somebody uncomfortable. Right,
and there's kind of an important thing to mention there as well. this doesn't have to be, the recruitable companions in Baldur's Gate 3. It's which I've seen other content creators refer to as a bi nightmare. You don't need to fill your campaign with like hot bisexual recruitable companions. Like that's not, that's very much a video game thing.
Yes.
And that's not that's not something you need to do for your campaign, and it's honestly probably something you should avoid. To some degrees, it just feels a little disingenuous. Like your NPCs, for the most part, should be somewhat complex, should have their own preferences, and it should, it shouldn't. Your entire campaign shouldn't be a datum up where various player characters are just trying to decide
which one of the NPCs
who they want to
think
marry
is
at
the
the end of
cutest.
the campaign.
Yeah.
Right. It's it should be a little more complex than that, and that's something that a tabletop RPG lets you do far better than a video game. And players, whether intentionally or not, sort of seeking that thing out, it doesn't necessarily have to be truly rewarded, but it should be something that the DM takes some note of, because partially it just really helps to make the world more complex, make the world and the relationships the characters have with the world more interesting. Whether it's the DM directly introducing them or the players searching them out on their own.
I think that if you make interesting, complex NPCs that are well tied into the world and are interesting characters, and you make them with a variety of personalities and preferences and mindsets, and they are just, your world is a flood with that kind of individual, some players will have some characters who will sometimes be attracted to that.
Right.
And that can lead to that happening. But I think player instigation should be 99% of that, unless it's the overly flirtatious shopkeep that everyone who comes in, they're kind of trying to ogle and then put moves on, or the sort of braggart, roguish bard, NPC that they keep seeing at the same bar and keeps hitting on the sorcerer every time they come in because that's just that character. And you can kind of throw those sorts of things, and that can be kind of fun silliness that the player either is like, my character is profoundly uncomfortable and tells this person to F off, and then you go haha, funny moment, move on.
I break his nose.
Yeah, yeah, or it's that kind of comic relief moment that way, or they buy into it and they kind of play off of it, and if the player would have fun doing that, they would do that. You don't want to shoehorn it in ever, right? Because then it's just kind of more often than not be uncomfortable.
And quite often it's going to be sort of a background element of the campaign that you're running, if it's a part of that campaign at all. In both characters I've played and in campaigns that I've run, that has tended to be the case. Think of, back to original Dracos way back in the day. My halfling rogue had a bad habit of sleeping with half-orcs and minotaurs. Half-orcs that are more orc than half.
Lowercase h, capital
O. But there was just sort of one character that one NPC that he that's where his heart truly was, and it
a sea captain off at sea,
and that was just that was just a background element of that campaign that just came up off and on, and it was a background element of my character, or the sort of Treasure Planet inspired campaign that I ran with where I introduced a kind of romantic interest because that NPC is the one who sort of instigated it by asking a character out on a date, and it's it's done to make the world more complex and to make the relationship the characters have to certain factions more complex, because that was a messy relationship just in the sense of this admiral or this commodore specifically for this naval fleet, and this character was rapidly becoming a pirate captain, and both characters have their reasons for their allegiances and reasons for their particular hatreds, and that relationship starts to become very complex and make both characters sort of question some of their own decision making, some of their own allegiances, but it's always just a background element of that story. It never became the focus of the story, and it never even really tied in any like super meaningful way into sort of the main quest line.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes the sort of dates that had involved in it were story driven or hand wavy.
Yes.
You know, it's not the sort of thing where you don't say, okay, 3 other players at the table, 5 other players at the table. You guys sit back and watch me and this player have a uncomfortable first date experience where we sit here and come up with what to talk about. Like, that's not the point of it. You could do something like that for a short amount of time and it could be kind of funny, but you'd want to move on fairly quickly. Oftentimes, you just want it to be impactful to the story or a funny side thing. All the while keeping people's comfort levels at the forefront of your mind.
Yes.
And there are times where I will push that line a little bit, and that's with players that I know personally very well, and it will never be something that would make the rest of the table like profoundly uncomfortable. Like, the good example of this is recently in an episode of the Skygate series, or kind of Underdark series that I'm running right now. There's a character who is this very old dwarven queen who has taken a liking to one of the party members, and it's never this big part of it's kind of this side funny thing that happens a couple different times. And there's a part where she is eating dried meat and staring at this character, and so I, as the DM, just sat there making terrible chewing noises and staring at one of the players at the table, whom I've known for years and am good friends with, and know that will make him somewhat uncomfortable, but everyone will just be giggling about it and we can move on. You can do something along those lines. It's just knowing your players and knowing that you're not going to, like... There's a big difference between that and, like, being, like... pushy with intimacy on somebody or something like that. Something that would, like, make a person, could potentially trigger something in a person that would make them truly, profoundly uncomfortable.
Well, you know, and ultimately those steps, those sort of intimate or, you know, lack of intimate steps, should largely be on the player.
Mm-hmm.
And should largely be sort of at the player's pace. If the relationship, you know, this romantic relationship that you're putting in the campaign is sort of taking that route. Because that helps to ensure that they're not going to get profoundly uncomfortable by something like that happening. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's entirely possible for campaigns to go on long enough that, you know, you have to RP through a marriage or something like that. And that's like, and we've talked before about how those types of events, especially when you make a big deal out of them, tend to be very fun and very memorable for the party.
And those events oftentimes should be less about just a one-on-one romantic connection and this, like, these heartfelt vows and stuff like that. That could be a part of it if it's a really deep NPC relationship that's built over the course of a long campaign. But a lot of it is it's a party episode. It's an event where everybody has a different thing they're doing there. Maybe the bard is performing there, and
it tends to be a lot less about the wedding itself and a lot more about the various shenanigans that the player characters are up to.
Of course, you make your eldritch warlock friend your best man so that he has to give a speech when he is unable to communicate with anybody very effectively because his mind is off in the astral.
I was kind of hoping he was the one officiating the wedding because I want to know what a Cthulhu wedding looks like.
There's like a knot tying ceremony, but it's done with 2 eldritch otherworldly tentacles that appear through portals, and they have to do some knot and bring it together.
You just tie 2 smaller eldritch beings together.
Yes. Nothing is stronger than the bind between Mothling, Glorfin, and Argenturnpool of the Dark Realms, as you can see by these 2 intertwined tentacles. May this be as strong as your bond. That could be an amazing moment that everyone has a really fun time with.
You know, and it forces the rest of the party to kind of fill roles within that wedding, and you know, and gives rise to good character moments, not just for the sort of player character involved, but everybody involved. When the giant barbarian best man is weeping at the wedding, like Brody at your wedding.
Yes,
who's just a real life D&D barbarian.
Actually, Brody very much is.
I'm crying, so I look over at the actual D&D barbarian Brody because I know he'll be standing strong, and he's crying,
bawling,
and that just makes me cry much worse. It was a rough day. It was a great day, but it was a rough day.
Yeah.
Like, you'll get those moments. if you kind of take that route and stuff. And again, if nothing else, it's making the NPC more complex. It's making those relationships that the player characters have with the world more complex and more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, like, players like it when they're sort of listened to, or when they sort of pursue something under their own initiative and kind of find it rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
So players, you know, in many cases, kind of seeking out some of those romance options are, and finding them rewarded tends to be a very satisfying experience.
And it can be something that's rewarding in a story-driven way, rewarding in a personal character way. Yeah. It can also be rewarding in a more mechanical way of, like, if you are in a romance quest line, again, kind of video gaming it, with a character who is the prince of the kingdom you're in, all of a sudden you're invited to a really nice dinner, and you have an opportunity to meet a lot of the important people around the city. And then it's that romance line that one character is on becomes a RP opportunity for the entire party.
Right.
And it lets you tie new story in a very personal way to one of the characters. And it also, I mean, avoid this being your constant thing. It gives you something to threaten as well. As the DM, a threat to a character, an NPC that a party member has begun like falling in love with, is a very real threat that they will answer with an iron fist, and that can be a very rewarding thing of like saving the person that your character has grown to care about.
All of a sudden, you have a knight you have to rescue from a tower
as a princess, and that's another. It also gives you an opportunity to both play into tropes and to flip them on their heads.
And we've talked before about how like you should really use tropes a lot more in D&D, because player characters are really going to appreciate having to actually rescue a princess from a tower.
Mm-hmm. I mean, especially if they're playing a knight in shining armor.
And we've talked before about how much fun it would be to play a D&D campaign where you're a adventuring company that specializes in like rescuing maidens, and then you get to play around with that trope as well, where it's like okay, fellas, this isn't technically a princess we're rescuing from a evil sorcerer's tower. It's a prince, but like it's like, this is kind of what we do, so we can let it slide. You know, and like that is a campaign built upon a specific trope that would be an immense amount of fun. And like romance options in tabletop RPGs kind of lean into that same territory.
You absolutely can make them do so, and you can also take and disarm you have a character like the kind of Warbin, who is this kind of heroic dwarven barbaric hero who is profoundly awkward and uncomfortable at times in romance situations. So you have this guy who's, you know, having statues built of him, who whenever the dragonborn bard is trying to, start a romance off, is kind of like awkward and like trying his best, but is like used to living rough and fighting and rough and tumble, and all of a sudden is like, well, now I'm trying to like be romantic, and I'm not exactly sure how to do that. And that's just fun moments. I think that the broad advice to give is, if you're going to use romance in a game, make it fun, make it meaningful, or make it both.
Yes.
It should never be something it should be fun, funny, silly, or it should be meaningful, tied into the story, and expand options in both roleplay as well as in like what the characters have access to and the storylines that can be kind of thrust upon.
And it's entirely possible that depending on this sort of particular romance questlines that player characters decide to try and pursue, that if you allow them to do that, it may well, you know, really change the course of certain elements of a campaign. And like, it's fine if that happens. Something that all DMs need to hear, even extremely experienced DMs, is that it is always okay if things don't go according to plan and that your plans for a campaign change. Because every campaign has these unfortunate, pesky things called player characters that we can't seem to get rid of. And they just destroy everything they touch. And they drive the campaign in directions that you never saw coming. They interact with things with timing that you never saw coming. And it's totally fine if... You know, it's totally fine if you have to change the main villain of your campaign because one of the player characters has the hots for who was supposed to be your main villain, who now kind of becomes a side villain. so that kind of goofy, meandering quest arc can kind of play out.
Yeah. And that's just broad advice for being a DM, is just to roll with the punches and to adjust story accordingly. And to remember that you are not the director of this play. You are a majority of the actors in this play. You are the set dressing of this play. But the main characters of this play do not have a script, and you have to react to them. Mm-hmm. You do not... And you can force them to react to what your other characters around them are doing, but they're driving the story, and that's what will make a better story.
Right.
Because then you have the creative juices of the entire group making the story instead of yours and your iron will being forced upon them.
And player characters, by and large, want to have the cinematic moments happen, and they want to...
And they want to have the romantic moments happen sometimes.
The player characters want those big, cool story moments, and those small, cool story moments, just as much as a DM does, so... Giving some of the reign over to the players is not a bad thing.
Not at all. So, in romance, options in games, make them fun, make them meaningful, make them both. Never make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that should always be step 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
And by that I mean, not making it uncomfortable is step 1, it's step 2, it's step 3. 4 is make it fun. 5 is make it meaningful. You want
Step
to...
6, never make it uncomfortable.
Never make it uncomfortable again, and then the rest of the steps are continue to not make it uncomfortable. Because it is something that can add to your game, but will not add to your game if it's at the detriment of people playing it.
Right.
So, know your play group. This is just... I feel like every video we've ever made has the advice of, like, get to know the people you're playing with, make a social contract, understand what people enjoy and what they dislike, and lean into that for a fun experience for
Absolutely.
everybody. Hope you found this interesting. Share your funniest romance story or your most meaningful one. I'd prefer not the most uncomfortable one. I feel like there's plenty of like Reddit threads out there and stuff that are about like the horror stories. You can absolutely share it if you feel the need to, but most of that is just, God, why is this person forcing this thing that they want to have into the game at everyone's detriment? We've all heard those. If you've had those, I'm very sorry.
Yes,
I hope you found a much better group. But I'd love to hear the fun stories, the ones that have gone really well or have made a really meaningful impact on your game or your world.
The point of this channel is to help tabletop games. By and large, the point of this channel is to help tabletop games run better. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be another platform spreading stories of all the times it's gone wrong.
Yes. We can all learn from those, but we'd rather hear the good stuff and learn from that in the nature of the comments of this video. Hope you enjoyed this. If you like this kind of content, we have a ton of stuff like this. We do the Bonus Action Podcast, which is kind of a longer form version of this. We have the Help Action, where I kind of break down specific rule sets or things, concepts, and give number crunch advice on how to run them. We have a ton of play on the channel, where we are doing currently 2 different D&D campaigns, both an Epic 6 style and a full kind of 1 to 20 style. We have the
Star
old
Wars
system, Savage Worlds, more of that coming, tons of stuff RPG related on the channel. So please check it out if you enjoyed this. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.